OverSoul 7 and the Museum of Time by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John, Chapter 6, A Challenge of Probabilities. 7 kept trying to speak, but again no one heard or saw him. Worse, an odd shifting seemed to take hold of everything, not just the furniture as before, but the very house itself. It was as if the place speeded up through time, or as if time speeded up through space. 7 couldn't decide which. But the walls themselves began to flutter almost like wooden curtains, and then to break up into beads and then into dots. 7 realized that the walls had vanished. He stood alone on a grassy knoll in a warm, dark night. The house and Dr. Bainbridge and the thief, indeed the entire neighborhood, were gone. Yet 7 was sure he was in the same place, though he wasn't sure just how he knew this. A soft wind blew past his face, and then he saw that the river, the same river, was still approximately the same distance away. 7 was more upset than he'd wanted to admit, because his experiences thus far had seemed to lack any kind of organization, or rather, while he could perceive some order, he didn't seem to know how it worked at all. Before, the house had given some orientation. Now it was gone. Besides this, Cypress seemed to have abandoned him, at least for the present. Any present, he thought, dejected. He looked about. As far as he could see, the area was entirely wooded except for the small clearing on which he stood. Where or when was he? Cypress, he called mentally, but there was no answer. Was this the spot on which the Bainbridge house stood? If so, from the viewpoint of the house's existence, was he in the future or the past? 7 looked up. 3 globes glittered in the far distance above the earth. He groaned and tried to recall Earth history. The first floating city was in operation in the 23rd century. He remembered because one of his personalities, Proteus, lived there. The second floating city came around the 25th century, and the third wasn't habitable until the late 28th century. OverSoul 7 let himself drop down on the uneven but grassy ground as he recognized his unhappy predicament. By his reckoning, it was about 2985, give or take a couple of centuries, so even if he was in the right space, he was 1,000 years off his target. Worse, 7 didn't dare walk outside of the area where the house was, or had been, because that must be the focus of whatever was happening. If he just sat there and thought back to the 20th century house, perhaps time would reverse itself. But the environment itself was rather unsettling. There were no ground lights at all, and from his position, the floating cities were no brighter than stars. A very fine rain was falling, so fine that it was more like a mist, and the grass was wet, and the trees made a murmuring sound as the water fell from one leaf to another. Otherwise, silence. Why 1,000 years in the future, where before he'd only bounced back and forth between the 19th and 20th centuries? Cypress, he called, and again there was no reply. 7 shivered. His body was wet, and though the air was warm enough, the rain had soaked through his polyester suit. No wonder mortals carried umbrellas, he thought miserably. Nor did he dare leave his body while it dried out, for fear a time reversal might come and whisk his body off without him. But how was it that all of this happened when he still had a body on? Cypress existed in every time, and so did he, Seven mused. So he couldn't be lost, but he felt very lost indeed. If he remembered his history properly, in one probability, the Earth in this century was a largely uninhabited planetary reservation area designed to protect nature, with visitors restricted. In another probability, though, the planet was nearly dead, bearing the lethal debris of countless nuclear wars. And in still another probability, it was just in the process of developing a new civilization. But Seven had no way of knowing which future he was in, except that it grew out of the Bainbridge's presence, both of them. Despite himself, OverSoul 7 noticed that the area was bathed in a soft, mysterious air that now seemed enhanced by the rainy mist. In some strange way, the landscape seemed enchanted and enchanting. On the other hand, it also possessed a quiet, waiting quality, as if it were a stage, in the few moments before play was to begin. Or, Seven thought suddenly, as if he were witnessing a probability in the making.
And was this the Bainbridge's Earth?
Before Seven could even begin to answer his own question, the sky exploded with images, and he saw a picture of such multidimensional proportions that he didn't know where to look first, much less how to interpret what he was seeing. The vision was so vast and astounding that he felt his consciousness struggling to expand its reach to contain it. The entire scene was one world with areas laid out in various time periods. The architectures and agricultures and technologies were changing in each segment, and the people were all wearing the unique clothes of their times. And yet, Seven saw, they moved from time to time as mortals now moved from place to place. There were dazzling cities and the most primitive huts, all in glowing mosaics. There were factories and stone tools, and emblems and flags of countries and religions and causes of which he'd never known. Then, abruptly, a particular person's figure would take prominence in a particular mosaic. The person, sometimes a male, sometimes a female, would make a simple motion, lift a vase, raise an arm, turn away, and as if in response, all of the other segments would change too. Different kinds of buildings would appear, or an army or a vast parade would rush into action. But as these persons executed their simple motions, the entire panorama was completely altered in one way or another. As OverSoul 7 tried to interpret his experience, he almost lost himself in his concentration. In one mosaic, for example, a woman in 13,000 BC picked up a simple tool, and in another mosaic, a spaceship took off. Then, however, the order of motion was reversed. The astronaut pushed a simple button on an instrument panel, and, as if in response, the woman picked up her tool. Then, so quickly that Seven couldn't follow, he saw George Bainbridge the First in his private attic study, a miniature, but glowing with intensity. And the Victorian George was peering out of the attic window at the very scene Seven was witnessing. At the same time, George the Third appeared, also in miniature, the antiseptic white dentist's office like a tiny, brilliant white closet against the sky. and George was looking down into the face of Gregory Diggs, the thief. The two of them were seemingly frozen in the same position forever, even while Seven had the feeling that the relationship between them were constantly changing. And again, simultaneously, in another mosaic, the patient at the mental institution who thought he was Christ suddenly held up his hand, as if to stop the entire cosmic production. And at once everything vanished, except for the landscape, which was again filled with mist. The wind had an unusual murmuring sound, as if voices were hidden in it somewhere. A hypnotizing, compelling, yet distant sound. Seven listened, knowing that whatever he was hearing wasn't sound as he was used to thinking of it, but an inner molecular rustling, as if the atoms of the rocks and the trees and the grass were all trying to speak, or manufacture tongues at once. The sounds changed several times until Seven finally made out their message. The codicils. But what did that mean? The inner sounds were more like vibrations that he translated into words, so that the very ground beneath Seven's feet vibrated, and so did the misty trees, until it formed everywhere those inner words. The codicils came rushing into Seven's mind. What are they? Seven asked mentally. But the moment he asked, the vibrations ceased, and Cypress stood beside him. Cypress looked more radiant than he'd ever seen her. Besides this, she seemed to have a kaleidoscope of images at her command, so that as she appeared, other images of herself cascaded from the main one, images of men and women of all ages and countries and times sparked out into the landscape and then exploded like firecrackers. Seven was almost abashed at Cypress's abilities. He felt quite powerless in the midst of such a display, as he stood there in his polyester permanent press suit, now more than slightly damp in the night's mist that had returned. In fact, by the time Cypress settled upon one image, the ancient woman with young appearance, or the young woman with ancient knowledge, Seven felt quite dejected. "I certainly am glad to see you," he said, "but I haven't the slightest idea of what's been happening. Even with a body, I can't seem to stay in the right time. And you saw the world vision I just saw." "I saw it," Cypress said gently. "You perceived more of it than I thought you would. Part of it you'll interpret as you go along. But none of my experiences seem orderly lately," Seven cried. "There's order there, I know, but I keep losing it." "You don't lose it," Cypress said softly. "It's there. You put off perceiving it for reasons you'll remember later. But I have some important clues to help you. There's an important dilemma, or rather, an important period of change approaching. Now, on the one hand, this change has happened, of course, and on the other hand, from the standpoint of George Bainbridge in the 20th century, it hasn't. He's approaching a vital intersection of probabilities, and you must learn to help your personalities in the probable areas of their lives as well as with the problems they are aware of." But Seven was truly dismayed. "You don't mean I have to handle a group of probable Georges?" he cried. Cypress smiled and ignored the outburst. "Remember your vision," she urged, in a tone he'd learned to pay attention to. "Important clues are there, too. Remember the personalities you saw in it, Diggs in particular. And remember, even for mortals, not all experience is physically manifest. Each person, 7, is partially responsible for the birth of probable worlds. There, don't frown. You're doing very well. Your suit is most appropriate, too. Exquisite 20th century, quite quaint. You're just saying that to cheer me up, 7 protested. But before he could finish, Cypress said, "Get back to your main line sentry for now, though, or you'll end up more confused than ever. And don't forget, there's a reason why George the First perceived Diggs." "I'm more confused than ever," 7 complained under his breath. "And how come my body travels through all those probabilities?" "You'd better get that young thief out of the house before the 20th century George catches on," Cypress said. "Worry about the rest later." Cypress vanished, and so did the 30th century night landscape. 7 stood, fully visible, he realized, in front of George Bainbridge and the 20th century thief. The house still had its Victorian appearance. "Who in thunder are you?" yelled George Bainbridge the First, seeing him this time. This time 7 concentrated with all his might. "Out, out!" he shouted at Gregory Diggs, and he shoved Gregory out of the 20th century door. This time he really felt his own muscles move. Almost at the same time he turned to George the First and commanded him to rush back up the 19th century stairs. Eyes ablaze with astonishment, George did as he was told. End chapter 6. Peace, light, and love. Aloha. Isn't this good?